Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, let's dive into this. You know those romanticized startup myths we always hear, right? Some genius has a literal lightning strike of an idea, builds it in their garage, and bam, instant billionaire. Well, it turns out building a company is actually a lot like navigating our own everyday lives. I mean, your very first plan almost never survives first contact with reality. But today, we aren't talking about myths. We're looking at the messy, real-world survival mechanics of company building, and why your original plan is basically destined to change once it hits the actual market.
In fact, we're going to immediately shatter that perfect first idea myth right now. 81%. According to a 2026 Wilbur Labs survey of tech founders, 81% end up pivoting from their original concept. Think about that. The very first idea is almost never the final one.
Which brings us to a really fascinating central mystery for today's explainer. If the very first idea is almost always wrong, how do any of these startups actually survive? Why do so many have to completely change course? And honestly, what separates the ones that manage to adapt successfully from the ones that just fade away?
To really understand this, we have to look at how a startup is fundamentally defined. Eric Ries, the creator of the lean startup methodology, he defines it as a human institution designed to create a new product or service under conditions of extreme uncertainty. And it's that extreme uncertainty that is the exact reason why that 81% statistic exists in the first place. You're literally building in the dark.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive difference between a startup and a traditional small business. A small business typically operates in a known, already determined paradigm, right? They're aiming for local profitability, like opening up a great neighborhood restaurant. Startups, on the other hand, they are built on a vision to take over the world. They are frantically searching for a fast, scalable growth model in completely uncharted territory.
And because they operate in the total unknown, the failure rates are just staggering. Depending on the industry you look at, somewhere between 65 to 80% of startups fail within their first 5 years. And if you look at the top reasons why, right there at the top, accounting for 42% of all failures, is simply a lack of consumer interest. It's the ultimate tragedy of building something absolutely beautiful that, nobody actually wants.
It's a really hard pill to swallow, but founders are actively learning from it. Over half, 54% of founders, to be exact, say their absolutely most important lesson from a past failure was the need to better understand product-market fit. Essentially, this is that magical, elusive moment when you finally build a product that a massive market desperately wants. Because without that, absolutely nothing else your company does even matters.
So how do they actually find that fit? Well, they map it out. A crucial tool for this is the business model canvas, specifically looking at the customer segments block. This is where founders sit down and formally define exactly who they are trying to reach. They do this specifically to avoid that number one killer we just talked about, weak demand. Because if you don't know exactly whose problem you're solving, you are totally flying blind.
And connected directly to those very specific customers is your value proposition. This is the bundle of products and services that actually solves that customer's problem. Together, your customer segments and your value propositions form your startup's core hypotheses. You are essentially guessing that this specific group of people will happily pay for this specific solution.
But here's the catch. How do you know if your guess is right before you completely run out of money? You need a survival engine. In the lean startup world, this is called innovation accounting. It's a totally new kind of accounting geared specifically toward disruptive innovation. It allows you to test those hypotheses with real data and actionable metrics, rather than just crossing your fingers and relying on gut feelings or, vanity numbers.
This survival engine essentially builds into a continuous, actionable, three-step loop that startups use to decide their ultimate fate. Step 1. Establish the baseline. Where's your product right now? Step 2. Tune the engine. You run an experiment to test your growth hypothesis. And then Step 3. The moment of truth. Pivot or persevere. Do you stay the course or do you change direction based on what the data just told you?
Which brings us to the word of the hour, the pivot. Now, a pivot is so often misunderstood as this random, desperate leap when things go horribly wrong. But it's not. It is actually a highly deliberate, structured course correction designed to test a brand new fundamental hypothesis about your product, your strategy, or your engine of growth.
And changing direction can be incredibly precise too. For instance, a zoom-in pivot is when a single, specific feature of your product suddenly becomes the entire product. Or a customer segment pivot. That's when you realize your product solves a very real problem,
but for a completely different group of people than you originally thought. The key takeaway here is that these are specific, highly strategic shifts based entirely on what you've learned.
So the crucial point is this really brilliant shift in perspective from Eric Ries. He says the true measure of runway is how many pivots a startup has left. Think about that. We usually think of a startup's runway purely in terms of months of cash left in the bank, right? But the true reality of survival is all about how many times a founder can adapt and iterate their ideas before that cash runs dry.
Because of this, timing is absolutely critical. Shockingly, 42% of founders actually regret holding on to their original idea for way too long. They wish they had pivoted or changed their business model much sooner. But, sunk costs, pride, and ego, they can keep founders stubbornly attached to a failing hypothesis, just burning through precious runway in the process.
But as we look at all this data, we really have to pause and acknowledge why it's so incredibly hard to let go. Constantly testing, failing, and iterating takes a massive psychological toll. The human cost of operating under that kind of extreme uncertainty, all while trying to manage the expectations of your investors and your employees, it's immense. This constant crushing pressure is what we call the founder's toll. The data on this is incredibly sobering. A staggering 90% of founders experience stress or burnout severe enough that it actually made them consider quitting altogether. The impossibly long hours, the constant pivoting, the always looming threat of total failure, it genuinely damages physical health, relationships, and just overall well-being.
And compounding all of that intense stress is isolation. 87% of founders found building a company to be way lonelier than they ever expected. And when you consider that 56% of founders actually launched their companies completely solo, without a co-founder to lean on, well, it's pretty easy to see how that intense emotional burden ends up falling entirely on just one person's shoulders.
So, with a failure rate pushing up to 80%, a super high probability that their very first idea is going to be completely wrong, and stress levels pushing 90% of them to the absolute brink of quitting, we really have to ask the ultimate question. Is failure really the end for these entrepreneurs? Does a failed startup just mean it's game over? Surprisingly, no, not at all. In fact, 81% of founders who experienced a devastating startup failure remained completely open to starting another company, and 31% of them were motivated to do so immediately. Serial founders learn from these massive missteps, building this incredible resilience that actually significantly improves their odds of success the next time around. The ultimate takeaway from this explainer is that in the world of extreme uncertainty, failure is not the end of the story. It's really just a beginning. Pivoting is a mandatory stepping stone to finding true product-market fit. So whether you're out there building a startup right now or just navigating the twists and turns of your own career, ask yourself, what if the things you consider your absolute biggest failures are actually just the exact data you need for your next great pivot?